The wind that scoured the Aleutian chain that June carried with it more than sleet and fog, it carried deception. While the eyes of the US Navy focused southward on Midway Atoll, a smaller Japanese task force struck at the cold, forgotten rim of the world. The invasion of the Aleutians, intended as a diversion for Admiral Yamamoto's grand plan, turned the empty volcanic islands into the stage for one of the war's strangest miracles. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the sun had barely risen above the grey horizon when Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga lifted his Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 210, tail code BII-124, from the deck of the carrier Ryujo. He was just 21, slender and soft-spoken, with a reputation among his comrades as a disciplined pilot with perfect formation flying instincts. Like most Zero pilots, he carried the calm pride of men who had never known defeat in the sky. The A6M2 Zero was the symbol of Japanese mastery of the air. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, it had humiliated every Allied aircraft sent against it. The Zero's range, over 1,900 miles, and its supernatural maneuverability had allowed Japanese aces to carve through American and British squadrons from the Philippines to the Coral Sea. US pilots called it the long-nosed ghost, a plane that seemed to defy physics. Koga's mission that day was to escort bombers striking Dutch Harbour, a bleak outpost on Unalaska Island, manned by a few hundred soldiers and sailors. As his formation crossed the jagged terrain, bursts of tracer fire reached up from the harbour's anti-aircraft guns. In the swirling mist and cloud, Koga's Zero was hit. A single lucky round from a .50 caliber machine gun pierced the oil line of his Nakajima Sakai engine. Thick black smoke poured over his canopy. He turned east, away from the harbour, hoping to reach a rendezvous point or an emergency landing site. His wingmen, petty officers Makoto Endo and Tsuguo Shikada, followed, calling over the radio for him to bail out. Koga refused. The Japanese code of the time was clear. Capture was shame, and a pilot's aircraft was to be preserved at all costs if there was any hope of recovery. Through the fog and rain, the 3 Zeros crossed over Akutan Island, an uninhabited strip of tundra and volcanic rock. At 20:15 hours, Koga's engine seized. He dropped his landing gear, but the marshy ground below was treacherous. Aboard his crippled plane, he lowered flaps and levelled off for a belly landing. His wheels dug in, flipped the Zero onto its nose, and then over onto its back. The impact broke Koga's neck instantly. His 2 comrades circled once, unable to land, and recorded the coordinates before returning to their carrier. They reported his death to the squadron leader. The following day, Japanese search planes tried to relocate the wreck but failed. Akutan Island disappeared into its perpetual shroud of mist. The Zero and its dead pilot were forgotten by both friend and foe. The war moved on, but the Aleutians remained a contested edge. In July 1942, a US Navy PBY Catalina from Dutch Harbour spotted the glint of metal among the mossy tundra while on routine patrol. The crew circled low, puzzled. The wreck looked too sleek, too clean for an American aircraft. When the Catalina landed nearby and the men trudged across the soggy ground, they realized they were looking at something extraordinary. The fighter lay inverted but almost completely intact. The wings were undamaged, the propeller bent slightly, and the fuselage, though scratched and muddy, bore only minor dents. On its flank, beneath the rising sun insignia, was the tail code, BII-124. The pilot's body, still strapped in, had been preserved by the cold. His silk scarf, flight log, and sidearm were recovered and buried with military respect a few hundred yards away. Naval intelligence officers were summoned immediately. They had been searching desperately for a flyable Zero since the war began. Until now, every example encountered had been destroyed in combat or scuttled. The intact A6M2 on Akutan was, in their eyes, a gift from Providence, a chance to solve the mystery of the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific. For months, Allied pilots had sent back reports that defied engineering logic. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outrange every fighter they possessed. American and British intelligence had guessed at its design, believing it was too heavy to be that maneuverable, or that it carried armor that somehow did not exist. Now, the answers lay before them, half buried in Alaskan mud. The recovery operation was arduous. Naval engineers disassembled the aircraft piece by piece, marking each panel and wire. They found the airframe remarkably light, barely 3,700 kilograms fully loaded, achieved by sacrificing armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. Every inch of metal was shaped for aerodynamic efficiency. Even the rivets were flush-mounted. The Sakai 12 radial engine was compact and precisely tuned, with its twin cowl-mounted machine guns perfectly synchronized through the propeller arc. By late July 1942, the parts were shipped first to Dutch Harbor, then to Seattle, and finally by rail to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. The operation was conducted in absolute secrecy. To the public, the aircraft was listed merely as Captured Japanese Fighter Number. One inside Naval Air Technical Intelligence Command, it was given a new name, a K-1, for the island where it had fallen. As the crate was unloaded onto the tarmac at North Island, a hush fell over the engineers and officers present. They were looking at what had seemed for 7 months like an invincible weapon. In the first half of 1942 alone, the Zero had helped sink or cripple dozens of Allied ships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and held aerial supremacy from the Coral Sea to the Indian Ocean. Every Allied fighter pilot had learned to fear the silhouette of its long, curved wings and its pale grey-green skin. But now the myth could be tested. The US Navy had the Zero's beating heart. Its secrets would soon belong not to the rising sun, but to the nation that would rise to meet it. As night fell over San Diego, the crates were sealed again under guard. A naval intelligence officer wrote a single line in his daily report. Aircraft believed to be complete and repairable. Condition: excellent. Historical value: inestimable. In that moment, far from the fog and tundra of the Aleutians, the balance of air power in the Pacific began to shift. The Zero that had once ruled the skies was now a captive. And from its silent frame, engineers would learn not just how to defeat it, but how to build something that would utterly surpass it. The ghost of Akutan, as it would later be called, had crossed an ocean not as a weapon, but as a messenger. And the message was clear. Japan's greatest advantage had just changed sides. In the cool morning light of August 1942, the hangar at North Island Naval Air Station felt less like a repair bay and more like a surgical theatre. The patient, a pale grey fighter bearing the red sun of the Imperial Navy, lay in pieces across the concrete floor. Mechanics, engineers, and intelligence officers moved quietly, clipboards in hand, as if they were performing an autopsy on a creature once thought immortal. The Akutan Zero, serial number 4593, was being reborn under American eyes. The team assigned to the project was small but elite. Engineers from Grumman, Lockheed, and the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics, alongside test pilots, Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders and Lieutenant Frederick Trapnell, both veterans of pre-war flight testing. Their task was simple in description, but immense in consequence: understand exactly what made Japan's A6M-2 so deadly. Every measurement was logged. The men were stunned by what they found. The entire airframe was built for one purpose: agility. Its aluminum alloy skin was thinner than anything the Americans dared use on combat aircraft. It had no armor plate behind the pilot's seat, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and minimal protection for control cables. Every ounce saved was converted into lift and range. Sanders would later write in his test log, "It is a designer's masterpiece of balance and simplicity, but it lives on the knife's edge between perfection and catastrophe." In September, The Zero's Sakai engine was reassembled, its carburetor adjusted for American fuel. On September 20th, 1942, the aircraft rolled out onto the North Island runway. The insignia of the rising sun was still faintly visible beneath the hastily applied blue and white stars of the U.S. Navy. Sanders climbed into the open cockpit, strapped in, and eased the throttle forward. The engine caught instantly, a deep, smooth hum unlike any American radial. When the Zero lifted off, it was as if gravity itself hesitated. The aircraft climbed at over 3,000 feet per minute, turning effortlessly within a radius that no Wildcat or P-40 could match. Sanders wrote that the plane handled like silk at low speed, but noted something else. Its wings shuddered and stalled suddenly in steep dives. The Zero's light construction, its greatest strength in maneuver, was also its doom when pushed to extremes. For the next 3 weeks, Sanders flew the Akutan Zero against nearly every American fighter available, the F4F Wildcat, the P-40 Warhawk, even early prototypes of Grumman's F6F Hellcat. The results were eye-opening. In a turning fight below 200 knots, the Zero was untouchable. But in a dive, the Hellcat easily outran it. At 300 knots and above, the American planes remained controllable, while the Zero's controls stiffened until its ailerons nearly froze. Sanders summarized the revelation in his official report to Naval Air Force's Pacific Fleet. Avoid dogfighting. Use the dive. Hit once, hit hard, and climb away. The Zero cannot follow. That sentence became doctrine. It was printed, paraphrased, and distributed across every Pacific airbase in the months that followed. Never turn with a Zero became the unwritten law of American pilots. While the Akutan Zero was tested in San Diego, halfway across the country, at Bethpage, New York, engineers at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation were in the final stages of developing a new fighter, one designed from the start to wrest control of the Pacific sky. It was the F6F Hellcat. Before Akutan, Grumman's engineers had only guesses about their enemy. After Akutan, they had hard data: weight, thrust, roll rate, stall speed, climb performance. They studied the Zero's tight turning radius and built the Hellcat with a wider one, knowing that raw power and dive speed would compensate. They learned from the Zero's frailty and gave the Hellcat thicker skin, self-sealing tanks and armor that could shrug off 20mm cannon fire. The captured Zero showed what to avoid and what to exploit. The Hellcat's designers even adjusted its control surfaces to remain light and responsive at high speeds, where the Zero's controls failed. In early 1943, as the first Hellcats rolled off the assembly line, Sanders's test results were circulating across Pacific squadrons. Pilots trained in mock combat using his findings. They practiced hit-and-run boom and zoom attacks, climbing back into the clouds after each strike. When they finally met the enemy, they were ready. The Akutan Zero had revealed its soul, and in doing so had written its own obituary. In March 1943, the North Island engineers painted over the Zero's wings and sealed it for storage. It had served its purpose. Within 6 months, Hellcats and Corsairs would take the skies in force, armed with the knowledge born from Koga's doomed landing. The final report filed to the Bureau of Aeronautics stated simply, "Captured Zero, evaluation complete. Enemy capabilities fully understood, countermeasures implemented." From the tundra of Akutan to the runways of San Diego, one man's death had rewritten the balance of the Pacific. The Zero's ghost had given the Americans what they needed most in 1942, hope, data, and time. And in that silence that followed the last test flight, the men who had taken apart Japan's greatest fighter stood in awe, not only of their own discovery, but of the strange symmetry of war. That sometimes victory begins with the study of your enemy's masterpiece. San Diego, late August 1942. The California sun hung low over the Pacific as the flat expanse of North Island Naval Air Station shimmered under the heat. Beneath the noise of aircraft engines and the constant rhythm of training flights, a secret arrived, under tarps, guarded by Marines, and known to only a handful of officers. The crate bore no markings. Its contents had crossed from the icy tundra of Akutan to the sweltering decks of an escort carrier, then down the spine of the American West under false paperwork. To most it was equipment salvage. To the men who waited at the hangar's far end, it was something far more valuable, the Imperial Japanese Navy's greatest weapon, captured intact. Commander Eddie Sanders, a lean test pilot with a sharp eye and a reputation for pushing aircraft to their limits, was one of the few men cleared to see it. He had read the reports from the Aleutians, how the Japanese Zero had humiliated Allied pilots across the Pacific. Sanders had watched friends shot down by invisible predators, planes that could climb like hawks and turn inside any American fighter. Now one of those predators lay just beyond the hangar doors. "Bring it in carefully," he ordered, as sailors unfastened the crate's panels. When the last board was pried loose, a silence fell. Even stripped of its propeller and engine cowl, the aircraft seemed alive, sleek, curved and alien in its simplicity. Its pale grey-green skin caught the light like glass. On its tail, the red sun of Japan still burned faintly through the grime. The Zero looked less like a machine of war than a bird sculpted for speed. Sanders stepped forward, hands resting on the fuselage. "So this is what they've been flying," he murmured. "No wonder they've been running circles around us." Over the following weeks, the Zero was restored in secrecy. American mechanics, under the supervision of Navy engineers and intelligence officers, catalogued every bolt and rivet. They marvelled at the aircraft's lightness, its frame built from an aluminum alloy called extra superduralumin, lighter and stronger than anything the US factories had yet mastered. Even the fuel lines and fittings had been pared down to shave off ounces. Yet the brilliance came with a price. There was no armour plate behind the pilot's seat, no self-sealing fuel tanks. One tracer round could turn it into a torch. By mid-September, the A6M2, now marked simply as AK-1, stood ready for flight. It gleamed on the tarmac under the California sky, restored to full operational condition. Sanders walked around it one last time before climbing into the cockpit. The controls felt different, more intuitive, as though every lever and dial had been placed exactly where a pilot's hand would expect them. He signalled to the ground crew. The captured Sakai engine sputtered, then roared to life, the propeller slicing the air with a sharp metallic whine. The sound turned heads across the base, an unmistakable Japanese engine echoing over American soil. Sanders took off, the Zero leaping from the runway like a falcon freed from its hood. As it climbed, the pilot felt its uncanny grace, how effortlessly it responded, how little force it needed to roll or turn. He banked hard left, tighter still, and the plane seemed to read his thoughts. He laughed aloud inside the cockpit. "My God," he radioed to the ground, "it flies like it's alive." From the observation tower, technicians and officers watched, spellbound. Rear Admiral Frederick Trapnell, the Navy's chief test pilot and flight engineer, scribbled notes. "Get every detail," he ordered. "We'll rebuild this advantage." Day after day, Sanders pushed the Zero to its limits. He discovered its strengths and, crucially, its weaknesses. At speeds above 300 knots, the controls stiffened. The light frame began to flutter under stress. Its magic turned brittle in a dive. The reports flowed to Washington, to the Pacific Fleet, to carrier squadrons fighting for survival. American tacticians studied the data and reshaped air combat doctrine overnight. They learned how to beat the unbeatable. The memo became legend. Never dogfight a Zero. Use speed, use altitude, hit once and get away. Soon, Grumman's engineers at Bethpage began applying the lessons to new designs. The F6F Hellcat, heavier, faster, armoured, would rise from the blueprint with the Akutan Zero's ghost in its bones. In the hangar after a final test flight, Sanders climbed down, wiping oil from his gloves. "If we hadn't found her," he said quietly, "we'd still be dying trying to guess what she could do." The others nodded. They all knew it. That fate, or luck, or the stillness of an Alaskan bog had shifted the balance of the Pacific. Outside, the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the ocean in bronze. The captured Zero rested behind the hangar doors, its red sun fading in the light. What had once been Japan's greatest secret was now America's, and though no one would speak of it publicly for years, every man who had touched that aircraft knew the truth. The tide of the air war had begun to turn, not in the skies over Midway or Guadalcanal, but in a silent hangar on the California coast where the ghost of Akutan had taught its final lesson. North Island, October 1942. The fog rolled in from the Pacific, softening the roar of engines and the clang of tools, but the test flights never stopped. In Hangar 12, under armed watch, the Akutan Zero rested between missions, its propeller stilled, its smooth skin dusted with California grit. The mechanics moved around it like priests tending an altar. The lessons it had begun to teach were already rewriting the language of air combat. Commander Eddie Sanders had flown the Zero more than 24 times now. Each takeoff revealed another secret, another nuance. He'd learned to feel when the aircraft whispered its limits, a shudder at high dive speeds, the sluggish bite of its ailerons above 300 knots, the way its wings flexed under G-loads. Every vibration told him something about its soul and its weakness. His latest tests were not alone. North Island had become a quiet laboratory of imitation and invention. The Navy brought in pilots from all corners, men who had fought at Coral Sea, Midway and Guadalcanal, to watch the Zero in flight. Among them was Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, the wiry tactician whose Thatch weave had already saved lives against the seemingly unbeatable enemy. Thatch stood at the runway's edge one afternoon, notebook in hand, watching Sanders climb in. "I want to see how she rolls at speed," Sanders said, adjusting his oxygen mask. "Try it above 340 knots, Thatch called out. "That's where our Wildcats start to pull away." The Zero lifted gracefully, circling over the base, sunlight glinting off its wings. Then Sanders nosed over, accelerating in a dive. The speed built, 300, 320, 340, and suddenly the elegant machine stiffened like iron. Sanders wrestled the stick. The aircraft resisted, refusing to roll. He levelled out just above the ocean's glittering surface and pulled back hard, the G-forces crushing his ribs. When he landed, sweat streamed down his face, but his eyes shone. "She can't roll fast at high speed," he said breathlessly. "She's trapped by her own grace." Thatch smiled. "Then that's where we kill her." From those words, a doctrine was born. American pilots were drilled in new tactics: never turn with a Zero, never fight on its terms. Instead, dive from above, strike once, then use the superior speed of heavier aircraft to climb away. Energy fighting, not dogfighting. It was a revolution in the sky. The intelligence officers at North Island compiled Sanders' flight logs and Thatch's observations into a report stamped "Confidential Tactical Employment." Against the Japanese Zero copies were sent to every Navy and Marine Corps squadron in the Pacific. Within weeks, American flyers were reading the lessons of Akutan in briefing tents from Hawaii to Henderson Field. Meanwhile, in the hangar, engineers studied every bolt and weld. The Zero's construction was an education in itself, beauty and sacrifice intertwined. Its engine, a Nakajima Sakai 12, was light but temperamental, its skin so thin you could dent it with a thumb. The Japanese had built it for agility, not survival. Sanders watched as engineers compared it to blueprints of the upcoming F6F Hellcat. "We can't match their lightness," one said, "but we can outlast them." The Hellcat's designers borrowed what mattered: the streamlined aerodynamics, the broad view canopy, the sensitive control harmony, and discarded the fragility. They were building something that could not only fight the Zero, but outlive it. As the tests continued, word of the captured Zero began to spread through whispers. Pilots who passed through North Island swore they'd glimpsed it under tarp, its red sun hidden but unmistakable. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was the most studied aircraft in America. In quiet moments, Sanders sometimes felt uneasy. He'd grown almost fond of the machine, its elegance, its quiet hum at cruising speed. It was strange to admire what had killed so many. But he couldn't deny the bond between pilot and plane. In flying it, he'd understood his enemy more deeply than any report could convey. One evening, after a late test, he lingered by the hangar doors. The sun had sunk low, staining the Pacific crimson. He looked at the Zero, its nose tilted skyward, and thought of the man who'd died landing it. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, frozen in the Alaskan tundra, unaware that his death had changed the course of the war. Sanders touched the fuselage lightly. "You taught us more than you'll ever know," he whispered. That autumn, as reports from the Solomon Islands reached San Diego, the first tangible proof arrived. American pilots flying new tactics had begun turning the tables. At Santa Cruz and over Guadalcanal, Zeros fell to Wildcats that fought smart, diving fast, slashing once and escaping before the enemy could turn. By December, the Akutan Zero's flying days were over. Its engine hours were logged, its secrets recorded. The aircraft was wheeled into storage, its propeller still and its mission complete. Commander Sanders watched as the hangar lights dimmed around it. He knew it had done its part, silently, without glory. In a war fought with machines and men, this one machine had become a bridge between them, transforming ignorance into understanding and fear into strategy. Outside, the night deepened over the Pacific. The sound of American engines, Wildcats, Dauntlesses, Avengers, filled the dark sky. The Zero's lessons now belonged to them. Bethpage, Long Island, January 1943. The snow fell in quiet sheets across the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, coating the corrugated roofs and the runway with a soft white that belied the war pulsing beyond the horizon. Inside the cavernous Plant No. 3, the air buzzed with urgency. Draftsmen bent over blueprints, engineers shouted over the hiss of welders, and at the centre of it all, the prototype of America's next great naval fighter stood gleaming beneath floodlights, the F6F Hellcat. The lessons of Akutan had travelled across the continent, packed in top-secret files and engineers' notebooks. Commander Eddie Sanders' test reports from North Island had been read line by Grumman's chief designer, Leroy Grumman, and his brilliant engineer, William Schwendler. Every flaw, every strength of the Japanese, a 6M20, had been dissected. The Hellcat would be its answer, heavier, faster, tougher, and built for men who would not break under pressure. "The Zero dances," Grumman told his team. "We're not here to dance. We're here to win." In December 1942, the first Hellcat prototype had taken flight. It had already shown promise, more powerful than the Wildcat, more forgiving than the Corsair. Yet now, in the winter of 1943, refinements were coming fast. The airframe was strengthened. A new 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine replaced its smaller predecessor. And behind the control stick, the cockpit canopy was redesigned for the widest possible view. The engineers called it Koga's window, a quiet nod to the dead Japanese pilot whose captured aircraft had started it all. Flight tests confirmed what Grumman's instincts had told him. This was the fighter that would take back the Pacific. The Hellcat could climb like a homesick angel, dive like a stone, and absorb punishment that would shatter a Zero. Where the Japanese plane prized agility, the Hellcat was built for forgiveness, stable on takeoff, responsive in combat, easy to maintain on a pitching carrier deck. Still, some doubted. The Bureau of Aeronautics wanted results, not theory. So in March 1943, the Navy assigned Commander Sanders himself to evaluate the Hellcat at Naval Air Station Anacostia. The same man who had flown Koga's Zero would now test its American successor. When Sanders first climbed into the F6F's cockpit, he felt at once the difference: the solid weight beneath him, the smell of fresh paint and oil, the deep-throated growl of the double Wasp as it roared to life. He taxied out, took off, and banked hard over Chesapeake Bay. The plane responded instantly, yet without twitchiness. It was smooth, muscular. He tried a dive. The controls held firm past 400 knots. He rolled. No stiffness, no flutter. "She's steady as a rock," he told his crew chief afterward, "and she's got claws." Over the next weeks, Sanders pushed the Hellcat harder, flying mock dogfights against Wildcats and captured Zeros. The results were unmistakable. The Hellcat outclimbed, outdove, and, above all, outfought them. Against the Zero, its advantage was overwhelming. Reports soon reached Washington. The Navy approved full-scale production, ordering thousands before the final evaluation was even complete. "The Hellcat," wrote one admiral in his memo to the Chief of Naval Operations, "is the aircraft we have prayed for." By summer, Grumman's factories ran day and night. Women workers, Rosie the Riveters in blue jumpsuits, turned out fuselages and wings in record time. Test pilots called the assembly line the Iron Works, for the men and women of Grumman never stopped. By the end of 1943, one Hellcat was rolling off the line every hour. At North Island, where the Akutan Zero now sat crated in storage, the circle was complete. The same hangars that had once studied Japan's secret weapon were now receiving squadrons of new Hellcats fresh from Long Island. Training centres adapted instantly. Pilots drilled in boom and zoom tactics refined from the Zero's weaknesses. Manuals emphasized altitude, speed, and surprise. Veteran flyers from Guadalcanal briefed rookies, "Don't turn with him, dive on him." By August 1943, the first F6F squadrons were ready for combat. The USS Essex, America's newest carrier, took aboard the VF-9 Hellcats under Commander Rufus Pappy Lockwood. They had studied the Akutan findings. They had read Sanders' test reports. They knew what they were up against, and what they now possessed. As the Essex steamed toward the Central Pacific, its decks bristled with blue-grey fighters marked with white stars and bars. Beneath the paint, beneath the armour, was the ghost of Akutan, the knowledge wrung from Koga's final flight, the insight Sanders had flown to exhaustion to uncover, the engineering genius that had forged a machine worthy of the fight ahead. When the Hellcats roared off the carrier deck for the first time in combat over Marcus Island in September 1943, the pilots knew they were flying something different, something built because of their enemy and against him. And in the months that followed, the Pacific skies would bear witness. The Zero's reign was ending. The hunter had learned from the hunted. September 1st, 1943. Marcus Island, northwestern Pacific. The pre-dawn stillness broke as the USS Essex turned into the wind. One by one, the new F6F-3 Hellcats screamed down the deck and lifted into the grey light, their engines hammering the humid air with a confidence no American pilot had felt in 2 long years. Commander Rufus Pappy Lockwood led the squadron, VF-9, with the calm precision of a man who had watched too many of his comrades die in wildcats and buffaloes against the nimble Zero. The briefings had been clear: strike hard, keep altitude, don't dogfight. The lessons of Akutan were etched into every pilot's mind. Below, the Pacific rolled in a dark shimmer, indifferent. Ahead lay Marcus Island, a speck of coral and Japanese concrete guarded by anti-aircraft guns and fighters from the Imperial Navy's 381st Air Group. For the first time, the Zero would face the machine built to destroy it. At 0700 hours, radar picked up contacts rising from the island. "Zeeks, 6 high," came the radio crackle from Ensign Roy Harris, a 22-year-old from Kansas. Lockwood's voice was steady. "All right, boys, remember your drills, keep your speed, don't play their game." The Japanese pilots, veterans of the Solomons, believed they faced the same slow, underpowered foes as before. They dived in with confidence, the lethal dance they had perfected since Pearl Harbor. But as they turned, the Hellcats didn't follow. They climbed, they waited, and then they struck. From 10,000 feet, Lockwood rolled inverted and dropped into a dive. The R-2800 engine howled, the Hellcat accelerating past 400 knots. He fired a 3-second burst from his 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns. The tracer stream connected. The first Zero disintegrated mid-roll, a white flash followed by smoke and falling debris. Splash one, Zeke! In minutes, the battle turned brutal. The Hellcats dove and climbed, hit and escaped. The Zeros, trying to twist into turning fights, found themselves overshot or shredded by the heavier American guns. One Japanese pilot, Petty Officer First Class Kenji Miyazaki, later wrote in his post-war memoir, "They did not fight as before. They came down from above, struck like hawks, and disappeared before we could react. I had never seen such speed in a Grumman before. In just 20 minutes, VF-9 claimed 10 kills for the loss of 2 Hellcats, 1 to flak, 1 to fuel fire. The ratio was staggering, but it was not just numbers, it was the feeling that changed." When the squadron returned to the Essex, deck crews waved and shouted. For the first time, Hellcats came back with more victory flags than bullet holes. Lockwood's after-action report was brief, almost understated. Aircraft performed beyond expectations. The Zero is now vulnerable. Recommend full deployment. That single line travelled through Pacific Fleet Intelligence, through Buair and to Washington. Admiral Chester Nimitz, briefed the next day, wrote a simple note in the margin. At last. The victories continued. In October, during the raid on Wake Island, Hellcats from VF-16 engaged 20 Japanese Zeros. They downed 30, double-counted kills aside, for the loss of 1 pilot. At Tarawa, Hellcats provided relentless air cover, suppressing enemy airfields before Marines landed on the beaches. The pattern was unmistakable. The Hellcat was rewriting the rules of the Pacific Air War. The key wasn't just firepower, it was forgiveness. Pilots returning to carriers raved about how stable the plane was at low speed and high stress. "The Corsair will kill you if you sneeze," one said. "The Hellcat will pat you on the back and get you home." Even Japan's intelligence services took notice. An intercepted memo from the Imperial Navy's Yokosuka Air Technical Arsenal in November 1943 reported, "The new Grumman model displays exceptional speed in dive and climb. Its pilot is protected by heavy armour and bulletproof glass. Our current fighter types cannot match it above 15,000 feet. It was the first formal acknowledgement that the Zero's era was ending. By December 1943, the Hellcat had become the U.S. Navy's frontline fighter across the Pacific. Grumman's Iron Works in Bethpage worked around the clock. More than 400 aircraft rolled out each month, shipped westward in convoys that stretched across the continent. Every pilot who strapped into a Hellcat carried with him the lineage of Akutan. The captured Zero's data informed everything: wing loading ratios, control harmonization, dive recovery angles. Even the standard Navy manual, Fighting Instructions for Carrier-Based Aircraft, now contained a full appendix labelled Tactical Employment Against a 6M-type aircraft, written directly from the Koga tests. One veteran summed it up perfectly at a reunion decades later. We didn't just build a better airplane, we built a smarter one, and we built it from their own shadow. The Hellcat's baptism of fire had proven more than technological superiority. It proved adaptation. The United States had taken its worst defeat, dissected it, learned from it, and returned with something no empire could withstand. As the Essex and her sisters steamed toward the Marshall Islands, every man aboard knew the sky had changed. The Zero, once the hunter, was now the hunted, and the Hellcat, born from wreckage in the Alaskan tundra, was only just beginning its reign. June 19th, 1944. The morning sun rose over the Philippine Sea like a pale coin, glinting off the wings of hundreds of aircraft arcing west from the American carriers. Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas, had begun. Below, 14 U.S. carriers, Essex, Yorktown, Hornet, Bunker Hill, and their escorting jeep carriers, steamed in perfect formation. Above them, 450 Grumman F6F Hellcats circled like a wall of blue steel. It would soon be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the first time, Japan threw nearly its entire remaining naval air strength into one decisive gamble. From Guam, Rota, and the carriers Zuikaku and Taiho, more than 400 Zeros and Judies lifted into the sky, many flown by hastily trained pilots. The Imperial Navy's veterans had been drained by 2 years of relentless combat. The new recruits had barely 100 flying hours. Most had never fired at a live target. The Americans, by contrast, had radar. They had well-drilled fighter direction officers guiding squadrons into ambush positions. And they had the Hellcat. At 1000 hours, radar operators aboard the USS Lexington reported, "Bandits inbound, 210 miles, bearing 320. The voice of Fighter Director Lieutenant Commander Joseph Eggert came over the circuit. "All Hellcats, intercept Angels 15. Let's go hunting." From VF-15, Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, a young Navy ace, pushed the throttle forward. His R-2800 engine roared. "Let's get 'em, boys," he said. At 20,000 feet, the sky darkened with enemy silhouettes. The first wave of 60 Japanese aircraft dived in. But this time, the fight did not go the way of the Zero. The Hellcats came head-on, guns blazing. 6 Brownings tore through the fragile Japanese planes, their unarmored fuel tanks erupting in orange blossoms. Vraciu downed 6 in 8 minutes, a record for the Pacific. "They just kept coming," he wrote later, "but they flew like beginners." You could almost see their fear. From the decks below, sailors watched in awe. One destroyer's gunner wrote in his log, "It looked like black confetti raining from the heavens, planes burning, spiraling, vanishing into the sea." By noon, US pilots had claimed 300 enemy aircraft destroyed. The kill ratio was beyond comprehension. Hellcats alone accounted for 244 of them. The numbers were confirmed later in Task Force 58's after-action report. June 19th, engagements resulted in estimated 350 enemy aircraft destroyed, own losses 30 aircraft, majority pilots recovered. The Zero, once the scourge of the Pacific, had been outflown, outgunned, and outnumbered. The data from Akutan, the engineering of Grumman, and the courage of thousands of carrier pilots had culminated in a single annihilating day. The Japanese called it Eigo Sakusen, Operation A last stand for their carrier fleet. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed his land-based air groups would soften the American carriers before his own air wings struck. But by the time his planes reached the U.S. task force, most were flying on fumes. The American radar pickets had seen them coming an hour before. From 25 miles out, Hellcats fell upon them. The tactical pattern was perfect, a series of high-side attacks followed by vertical reversals. Every lesson from the Akutan Zero test flights had been distilled into combat instinct. Petty Officer Toshio Ida, a surviving Japanese pilot, later recalled from captivity. "We thought we would surprise them, but they were already there." They came from the sun, fast, silent, in perfect order. I fired one burst and saw tracers pass far behind them. I had no chance. Even the vaunted Taiho, Japan's newest carrier, succumbed that day, not to air attack but to its own vulnerability. A single American torpedo ruptured her Avgas lines. Hours later, she exploded in a chain of fiery blasts. Japan's carrier fleet died with her. Back aboard the Lexington, as dusk settled, the flight deck crew counted the returning planes. One by one, the Hellcats touched down, their fuselages pitted and scarred but intact. Sailors cheered each landing. That night the ready rooms were electric. Men laughed, drank coffee, and scribbled kill tallies on chalkboards. "We finally owned the sky," said one VF-16 pilot. Yet among the celebrations there was a quiet recognition of what had changed. The Hellcat had not just beaten the Zero, it had ended an era. The myth of Japanese air superiority, born over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, was now ashes drifting on the Pacific winds. Admiral Nimitz's staff, reviewing after-action reports, wrote, "This day signifies the irreversible balance of power in the Pacific Air War. The enemy's loss in trained aviators cannot be recovered." Grumman's engineers received the same report weeks later. Leroy Grumman himself reportedly read it in silence, then said only, "Tell the boys, their airplane did its job." In the following months, the Hellcat's dominance became absolute. From the Marianas to the Philippines, from Leyte Gulf to Okinawa, its kill ratio held steady, 19-1. It was not just a statistic, it was the distilled result of everything the US had learned since 1941. Engineering precision, tactical discipline, pilot training, industrial output, all converged into one machine born from the wreck of Koga's Zero on Akutan Island. The irony was never lost on the men who flew her. At reunions years later, veterans would say, half joking, half reverent, "A Japanese pilot died on a lonely island, and out of it, the Navy was reborn." The Hellcat had turned the hunter's shadow into the weapon of victory. The Pacific belonged to her now, blue, endless, and mercilessly free. By late 1943, the Zero's supremacy had begun to erode. The once-feared ghost that haunted Allied pilots from the skies of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Burma was now facing its reckoning. The secrets gleaned from Koga's Akutan Zero had spread like wildfire through the US Navy's training manuals and tactical briefings. Every pilot knew the formula: never turn with a Zero, dive, roll, and strike from above. At Espiritu Santo, Commander Thomas "Tommy" Gatch briefed his Hellcat pilots aboard the USS Essex. He tapped a pointer against the blackboard, where a chalk diagram of the Zero's wingspan was scrawled beside a list of weaknesses. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice crisp over the drone of the carrier's engines, "the Zero is still a fine machine. But she's fragile. Paper skin, no armor. Her pilot's only advantage is surprise, and that's gone now. You meet her head-on, keep your speed, and you'll tear her apart." The young aviators, barely out of flight school, listened with grave attention. Some had lost friends over the Solomons to that same pale fighter. The thought that they now held the edge, thanks to a captured wreck from a lonely Alaskan island, seemed almost poetic. "Sir," one pilot asked, "you really think this'll end the Zero threat?" Gatch smiled thinly. "Not yet. But we'll make her bleed." Thousands of miles away, in Rabaul, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Shindo of the Imperial Japanese Navy paced before his men. The once proud 582nd Air Group had been reduced by constant attrition. The new generation of Allied planes, Hellcats, Corsairs, Lightnings, could now climb higher, dive faster, and take more punishment. But Shindo, like many of Japan's aces, refused to believe the Zero was obsolete. "Our spirit," he declared, "is what they cannot copy." The Zero is not just a machine, it is an extension of the samurai's soul. The men shouted, "Banzai!" and climbed into their aging fighters. The sun was sinking over the jungle as their silhouettes lifted from the coral runway, vanishing into the bruised sky. For a few moments, it seemed they could still dominate the heavens. The first American formation they encountered, however, shattered that illusion. Above Bougainville, the two squadrons met, 30 Zeros and 20 Hellcats. The fight erupted like a storm. Tracer fire streaked through the clouds. The once invincible Zeros twisted and rolled with desperate grace, but the Americans no longer followed their turns. They dove vertically, then climbed, hammering from above. Lieutenant Jack Hawke Conway of the Essex remembered what he'd read in the Akutan test reports. Hit the engine. It leaks oil fast under stress. Never chase a turn. You'll stall before he does. He saw a silver-grey Zero below him, looping hard left, the kind of bait that used to snare dozens of US pilots. But this time, Conway pulled up, rolling inverted before diving again in a clean arc. His 50 caliber guns roared. The Zero flared in a burst of flame and smoke, crashing into the canopy below. When the last of the dogfight's echoes faded, the sea below glittered with oil fires and floating wreckage. Only a handful of Zeros limped back to Rabaul. Shindo's landing gear collapsed on touchdown. He climbed out of the cockpit, shaken, staring at the bullet holes along his fuselage. The myth of the invincible Zero had died somewhere in that sky. At North Island, the original Akutan Zero sat now like a relic of another age. Its wings had been stripped, the fuselage patched and repainted in mock US markings. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, who had once test-flown the captured plane, stood beside it with a group of engineers and new recruits. "She taught us everything," Sanders said quietly, patting the metal skin. "How to beat her, how to build better." The recruits stared reverently at the aircraft. To them it was more than a war trophy. It was the turning point of an entire conflict. Sanders continued. "When I first flew this bird, I couldn't believe how light she was. No armour, no self-sealing tanks. It was suicide for protection. But she danced in the air like nothing we'd built. That's what caught us flat-footed at first. We thought technology alone won wars. Turns out, understanding the enemy does." A young mechanic asked, "What'll happen to her now?" Sanders shrugged. "Probably the museum someday, or a scrapyard if someone doesn't speak up. Either way, her war's over." Back in the Pacific, Japan was preparing for the unthinkable, defense. Engineers rushed to design newer, faster interceptors, the Raiden, the Shiden, the Kai-84. But none carried the soul of the Zero. It had been born in an age of daring and faith, not attrition and despair. At Atsugi Air Base, an old designer, Jiro Horikoshi, stood watching a row of crippled Zeros awaiting salvage. His masterpiece, once the terror of the Pacific, was now cannon fodder for superior Allied machines. He removed his cap and bowed slightly to the row of planes. "She gave us glory," he whispered, "and she took our sons." He knew then that his creation, though magnificent, had carried Japan too far, too fast. The very simplicity that made the Zero unmatched had also doomed it. Without armour or weight, there was no room for evolution. The machine had reached perfection, but perfection, he realized, cannot survive change. In early 1944, reports reached Washington. The Zero was no longer the dominant threat. The US Navy now ruled the skies from Tarawa to the Marianas. The lessons from Akutan had not only neutralized the enemy's best weapon, they had redefined American air combat itself. Still, somewhere in the Aleutian archives, a small brass plate marked a 6M2 Akutan remained stored in a cold, dim hangar. Few would ever know how much history had turned on that frozen island, how one pilot's death had shaped the course of a global war. As winter winds howled once more across the Bering Sea, the wreck of Koga's Zero, now stripped to a skeleton, rested quietly. Nature had reclaimed the tundra, the grasses growing through its ribs like green veins. And there, amid silence and snow, the ghost of the Akutan Zero seemed finally at peace. A fallen blade that had once cut through the sky, now laid to rest by the very enemy it had taught to fly stronger. By the time 1945 dawned, the skies over the Pacific had changed beyond recognition. The thundering presence of B-29 superfortresses replaced the sleek duels of fighter aces. Where the Zero had once danced gracefully across the heavens, now clouds of smoke and fire hung over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. The spirit of the Akutan Zero lingered, however, a silent echo that shaped every engagement. American pilots no longer feared the sudden scream of a diving enemy. They flew with confidence, precision, and cold efficiency born of years of study. The ghost of that captured plane, dissected and understood, lived in every Hellcat that took off from a carrier deck. At North Island, the once secret Zero stood under a sheet of canvas. Its wings had been removed for display. Its propeller gleamed like silver under fluorescent light. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders visited it one last time before his reassignment to the Pacific Fleet. He brushed his fingers along the faded Japanese markings. "You changed everything," he murmured. "Not just the war, the way we think." An officer passing by overheard. "Funny thing," he said, pausing. "All the blood spilled, all the loss, and it came down to one wreck on an island nobody'd ever heard of." Sanders nodded. One wreck, one pilot, one mistake. History's full of them. He signed the transfer papers. The Akutan Zero was officially decommissioned from military use and scheduled for shipment to Washington for potential museum preservation. Yet even as the paperwork sealed its fate, rumours persisted that it might be scrapped instead, its pieces recycled into new aircraft steel. No one could decide what to do with the ghost that had once terrified the Pacific. In Japan, the final months of war were a study in desperation. Fuel was scarce, airfields cratered, and the new aircraft meant to replace the Zero, the Raiden, the Shiden, the Ki-84, arrived too late, in too few numbers. Young, barely trained pilots filled the cockpits that once belonged to masters. At Yokosuka, Jiro Horikoshi stood watching a group of trainees bow before their aircraft. The Zero, his proud creation, was now little more than a vessel for kamikaze missions. Each young man tied a white headband around his brow, their faces serene in the dim morning light. He turned away, unable to watch the takeoff. "I made her to dance," he whispered, "not to die." The roar of engines rose behind him, the last flight of the old ghosts. In August 1945, as Japan fell silent under the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a single surviving Zero was found abandoned at Atsugi Air Base. American troops inspected it curiously, running their hands over its faded Hinomaru, now chipped and pale. One soldier laughed softly. "So this is the thing that started it all?" Another replied, "Not started it, defined it." They had no idea that halfway around the world, the original Akutan Zero sat forgotten in a Navy storage hangar, its fabric faded, its fame dimmed. The war it had shaped was over. In the years that followed, the Akutan Zero's remains became a relic of study and silence. Pieces of its fuselage were sent to museums, others lost to time. Its story, once top secret, entered the realm of legend, a tale whispered among aviators about how one enemy's death had taught another how to win. Decades later, an Alaskan fisherman named John Nelson stood on the tundra of Akutan Island. He had heard stories from his grandfather about the wreck, the strange Japanese plane that once lay gleaming in the summer grass. The wind howled across the desolate plain. Nothing remained now but rusted fragments buried in the moss, the bones of a machine that had changed the war. Nelson knelt, brushing the dirt from a small piece of metal stamped with kanji. He held it up to the grey light. "Guess you finally came home," he said softly. Far away, in a quiet corner of the Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center, A placard stands before a small display. A 6M2 Model 21-0, the Akutan plane, captured in 1942, tested in California. Its secrets changed the course of the Pacific War. Visitors pass by daily, rarely stopping. Few understand that this battered machine, once the terror of the Pacific, had shaped strategy, technology, and destiny itself. And in that stillness, beneath the sterile lights of history, the ghost of the Akutan Zero seems to whisper again, not in triumph or sorrow, but in the quiet pride of remembrance. A reminder that even the deadliest of enemies can leave behind a legacy not of destruction, but of understanding.